Child's Play turned a simple killer doll premise into one of horror's most enduring nightmares. Premiering in 1988, it followed young Andy Barclay, his mother Karen, and a seemingly innocent good guy doll possessed by the soul of serial killer Charles Lee Ray, better known as Chucky. Catherine Hicks's Karen Barclay anchors the story as a mother fighting to protect her son, while Alex Vincent's Andy becomes the frightened child no one believes. Chris Sandon's detective Mike Norris chases a crime he can't explain, and Brad Dourif's Charles Lee Ray gives the doll its chilling voice and personality. Across decades of sequels, from Bride of Chucky and Seed of Chucky to later entries that pulled Fiona Dourif into the family legacy, the film grew from a modest thriller into the foundation of a long-running horror franchise. Yet behind the animatronics, the voodoo chants, and that bright red hair was a saga of abandoned scripts, risky stunts, bruising test screenings, studio panic, and protests in the streets. These are 15 strange and often shocking facts about Child's Play, how its concept was first imagined, how it was reshaped in the editing room, and how it managed to survive controversy to become a cult horror touchstone. Long before serial killers were trapped in plastic, Child's Play began life as a very different horror story called Blood Buddy, and it was in some ways even darker than what ended up on screen. In Don Mancini's original script, there was no Charles Lee Ray, no ritual, and no supernatural soul transfer. Instead, the doll came to life through a deeply psychological twist. Andy slices his hand and mixes his blood with the toy's synthetic blood, turning the good guy into a warped version of a friendship pact. In this version, Buddy isn't possessed by a murderer. He is Andy's subconscious, every bit of repressed anger and frustration that a child can't express out loud. When a bully torments Andy, Buddy handles it. When a babysitter is too harsh, Buddy takes care of the problem. The tension came from a disturbing question audiences were forced to wrestle with. Is the doll truly alive, or is Andy losing his grip on reality? The push away from this ambiguous psychological horror came primarily from producer David Kersner, who worried that making the doll a manifestation of Andy's subconscious anger would render the young protagonist too unsympathetic. He also believed parents simply wouldn't buy their children a doll that bled. Kersner brought in Tom Holland on Steven Spielberg's recommendation to rewrite and direct. Holland introduced the idea of a serial killer possessing the doll. Co-writer John Lefia contributed additional changes, and while Mancini has said about half of his original draft survived, the core living subconscious idea was left behind. What emerged was less an internal horror about a child's mind, and more an external nightmare about evil refusing to die. Before Chucky ever picked up a knife, his human name, Charles Lee Ray, was designed to feel unsettling the instant you heard it, because it wasn't arbitrary. It was built by stitching together the names of 3 notorious real-world figures. Charles nods to Charles Manson, whose cult orchestrated murders that shocked the United States. Lee comes from Lee Harvey Oswald, connected with one of the most infamous assassinations of the 1960s. And Ray echoes James Earl Ray, whose name became tied to another national tragedy. The choice came from producer David Kersner, who has said these were 3 real-life killers that scared him as a kid. Combined into Charles Lee Ray, they form a composite that feels familiar even if you can't immediately place why. It sounds like it belongs in newspaper headlines and history books, not on a child's toy box. From the moment the name is spoken on screen, the film signals that this doll is carrying more than plastic and gears. It's carrying the weight of a very dark legacy. Before Chucky terrified audiences, another toy with a similar look was trying to do something much gentler. Hasbro's My Buddy line aimed to convince parents that little boys could have dolls too, a soft-faced companion with bright red hair, a striped shirt, blue overalls, and a permanent friendly grin. Then Child's Play arrived. Mancini's early script even called the killer doll Buddy until Hasbro's legal team stepped in, forcing the studio to change the name to Chucky. But the design echoes were unmistakable. Within a year of the movie's release, parents were walking past My Buddy dolls in stores and seeing something completely different from the marketing promise. Playskool reportedly tried to soften the image in the early 1990s, toning down the red hair and adjusting the expressions, but it wasn't enough. My Buddy sales plunged, production ended, and the toy quietly disappeared from shelves. The intention had been to normalize boys owning dolls. Instead, a horror film transformed that archetype into something many families no longer felt comfortable bringing home. The phrase "good guys" didn't just exist inside the world of Child's Play. There was also a real electronics chain called The Good Guys, headquartered in California and operating stores across California, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington, and they found themselves unexpectedly dragged into Chucky's orbit. As the movie played in theaters, prank callers began dialing the stores asking for good guy dolls. Real employees who dealt in televisions, stereos, and VCRs had to repeatedly explain that they sold electronics, not talking toys. The confusion grew intense enough that executives reportedly discussed changing the name entirely. The Good Guys had been a serious electronics presence since 1973, and the chain went on to outfit living rooms across the West Coast with the very equipment people used to watch movies like Child's Play. They kept the name and weathered the wave of jokes, operating until 2003 before the brand was eventually retired in 2008. Bringing Chucky to life required an intricate, almost orchestral level of coordination. Child's Play relied on multiple specialized dolls and a small army of 9 puppeteers to make one 2-foot figure feel like a living, thinking presence. At the center was Brock Winkloss, the lead puppeteer responsible for Chucky's mouth, using a radio-controlled mechanism strapped to his own face to synchronize the doll's lip movements to Brad Dourif's pre-recorded dialogue. While he focused on speech, as many as 8 other puppeteers handled eyes tracking across the room, eyebrows lifting in menace or surprise, hands tightening around props, and head tilts that made the doll seem curious or calculating. Each Chucky on set had a specific role, one built to sit and stare, another designed to thrash and struggle, and others built for wider shots requiring more movement. Every subtle expression came from people off-camera working in perfect sync. The result is part of why Chucky still feels tangible decades later. You're not watching a digital construct. You're watching a carefully choreographed illusion powered by human hands, radio controls, and mechanical ingenuity. When Chucky burns in the fireplace near the end of Child's Play, the effect is startlingly convincing because there is a real performer inside a Chucky suit fully engulfed in flames. Actor and stunt performer Ed Gale stepped into that fireproof costume, was layered in flame-retardant materials, coated in protective gel, and then ignited. The crew had a window of roughly 45 seconds before the heat became too dangerous. They broke the burn sequence into segments, one pass with an arm alight, another with flames across the torso, then a combination of both. The ordeal didn't end when the flames did. At one point, while hoisting him up between takes, the crew accidentally dropped Gale from a height of 6 to 8 feet, leaving him with a back injury that would linger. The sequence remains one of the film's most intense images, but it was earned through very real heat and impact. Brad Dourif's voice work as Chucky is unforgettable, especially the agonized screams as the doll burns. Those sounds weren't processed through layers of effects. They came from Dourif physically pushing himself to the edge in the recording booth. He ran laps around the studio before takes, arriving breathless and physically keyed up, then poured every bit of that intensity into sustained, full-throated screams that stretched close to a minute and a half. There was collateral fallout outside the booth. Dourif's 7-year-old daughter Fiona wandered near the studio and heard her father screaming, as if he were dying. Not understanding it was a performance, she ran, and Dourif had to stop, find her, and convince her it was only acting. Decades later, Fiona Dourif would join the franchise herself, playing Mika Pierce in Curse of Chucky and Cult of Chucky. The child once frightened by her father's off-screen screams became part of the on-screen legacy, a full-circle moment rooted in the same character that had once sent her running in tears. Chucky's voice is now inseparable from Brad Dourif, but the road to that final performance was longer than most fans realize. Initially, the filmmakers considered skipping a human actor entirely, planning to use a simple electronic overlay similar to the sound chips inside ordinary talking toys. When that proved unworkable, they turned to a real performer, but Dourif was unavailable because he was shooting Mississippi Burning. As an interim solution, the team hired John Franklin, whose work in Children of the Corn had proven he could be unsettling on screen, but the resulting Chucky sounded more like a cartoon sidekick than a dangerous killer. After negative test screenings, they tried to recast only to find Dorff still unavailable, now filming spontaneous combustion. They then cast Jessica Walter, betting on the same kind of unsettling vocal presence Mercedes McCambridge had brought to The Exorcist. Director Tom Holland responded positively to the menace in Walter's delivery, but test audiences found it too flatly evil, lacking the twisted charisma that would make Chucky memorable. Only once Dorff's schedule finally cleared could he return, re-recording Chucky's dialogue from start to finish. That mix of menace, dark humor, and volatility clicked instantly and cemented the character's identity. One of Child's Play's most emotionally charged moments takes place in a psychiatric hospital where Andy breaks down in fear and confusion. Director Tom Holland wanted genuine, raw emotion from 6-year-old Alex Vincent, and the way he pursued it has remained controversial. For that scene, Holland reportedly told Vincent that his parents were getting divorced, and that it was his fault. The intention was to provoke real tears and panic that the camera would capture, and it worked. Years later, producer David Kersner would say that Holland's approach bordered on cruelty to children, acknowledging how thin the line can be between directing and emotional manipulation when working with young actors. By today's standards, such a tactic would almost certainly be condemned. As an adult, Vincent has spoken in defense of Holland, saying he understood it as a trick and didn't carry it as a personal wound, but the story remains a stark snapshot of how different filmmaking practices once were. On paper, Child's Play could easily have been sold as a detective thriller with a horror twist. Chris Sandon, who played Detective Mike Norris, already had a notable career, and the studio initially gave him top billing over Catherine Hicks. Sandon disagreed. Looking at the script, he saw that Hicks's Karen Barkley was the emotional anchor of the story, present in far more scenes and carrying much of the film's weight. Rather than quietly accepting the studio's choice, Sandon went directly to the executives and argued that Hicks deserved top billing. The studio relented and reversed the order. It's a small detail many viewers might miss, but behind it lies a rare instance of an actor using his influence to redirect credit toward a co-star's contribution in a genre too often dominated by the villain's image. Child's Play also sparked a real-life romance. Catherine Hicks met special effects artist Kevin Jagger while working on the film. Jagger was the craftsman responsible for building and operating Chucky himself. At first, Hicks was understandably hesitant to let a man best known for animating a murderous doll handle her makeup, but as the production went on, their professional connection deepened into something more personal. By May 19, 1990, less than 2 years after the film's release, they were married. They went on to have a daughter, and remarkably, in an industry known for short-lived unions, have remained together for decades. Out of a story about a family under siege by a haunted toy came a real-world family built entirely behind the scenes. Child's Play premiered in U.S. theaters on November 9, 1988, and inside the movie, that is also the exact date when Charles Lee Ray's soul is transferred into the good guy doll. Once someone connected the dots, producer David Kersner and the marketing team recognized the opportunity and effectively reverse-engineered the release schedule to keep that alignment, turning opening weekend into what could be advertised as Chucky's birthday. Campaign materials warned that Chucky's birthday is your worst nightmare. The franchise later reinforced this in Bride of Chucky through a newspaper clipping listing Charles Lee Ray's death as November 9, 1988. For fans, the date became more than a line on a calendar. Each year, November 9th doubled as both an anniversary of the film's premiere and the in-universe birth of its central villain. While horror fans embraced Child's Play, not everyone was comfortable with its central image. After the film's release, protesters gathered outside MGM/United Artists headquarters, rallying against what they saw as a dangerous, corrupting influence, fearing that a film about a killer toy would inspire children toward violence. They carried signs, attracted local news crews, and turned the studio's front steps into a stage for their concerns. Eventually, MGM executive Jeffrey Hilton stepped outside and met with the protest leader, and after about 10 minutes of conversation, the demonstration dispersed. But the controversy unsettled the studio so deeply that after the film's release, they quietly distanced themselves from the franchise entirely, not continuing with the sequels. Universal later acquired the rights and carried Chucky forward. The character outlasted the wave of concern that first greeted him, but the protest remains a key chapter in how risk-averse studios can become when faced with public outcry. In another version of Child's Play, the closing credits might have rolled over a full-blown Chucky rock anthem. Composer Joe Renetti teamed with singer Simon Stokes to create an original song for the film's finale, featuring loud guitars, energetic vocals, and lyrics built around the doll's twisted persona, leaning hard into late 1980s glam rock style. Then came the test screenings. Audiences already processing the film's unsettling premise reached the end only to be greeted by a theme song that tilted the tone towards something almost playful, risking recasting Chucky as a mischievous mascot rather than a genuine threat. The decision was swift. The song was removed and replaced with atmospheric instrumental music that preserved the lingering unease. The rock track resurfaced on expanded soundtrack releases and early promotional materials, but it stayed out of the main film, a choice that helped maintain Child's Play as a horror experience first. Child's Play, as audiences know it, is a tight, suspenseful film, but before its release there existed a very different version, nearly 2 hours long, that played so poorly with test audiences it almost ended the franchise before it began. That early cut leaned into dark comedy and ambiguity, with Chucky appearing more frequently, cracking more jokes, and voiced by Jessica Walter rather than Brad Dourif. The story also left viewers uncertain whether Andy or the doll was responsible for the murders, echoing elements from Mancini's original blood buddy concept. Instead of being thrilled or terrified, test audiences left confused and disengaged. Recognizing the danger, director Tom Holland and producer David Kersner undertook emergency surgery on their own film, cutting roughly 25 minutes, pulling Chucky back into the shadows in the first act in line with Kersner's Jaws with Overall's philosophy, and bringing in Dourif to redefine the character's voice. The changes transformed the pacing entirely, and audiences at subsequent screenings gripped their seats instead of checking the time. That long, rough version survives only in Tom Holland's possession, and he has said he would be willing to restore and share it if there were serious interest. For now, it remains unseen, a reminder of how close Child's Play came to a very different fate.